The study door presented itself as a rather ordinary affair, painted a respectable shade of dark green and adorned with brass fittings that had been polished to a state of aggressive gleam. Peter observed that the lock was of a standard variety, the sort one might find in any moderately well-appointed country house, nothing particularly elaborate or difficult to manage, which struck him as rather more interesting than if it had been something exotic or tamper-proof. Marchmont produced the key from his waistcoat pocket with the gravity of a man producing a sacred relic, and Peter noted that his hand shook sufficiently to cause the metal to catch the light in irregular patterns. The door swung inward with a sort of creak that suggested either age or deliberate lack of oil, and Peter made a mental note to inquire later whether that sound had been recent or of long standing. The study itself was a revelation of a rather particular sort, a room that spoke not of intellectual pursuit, but of ostentatious display. Books lined the walls in sets so obviously matched that one suspected they had been purchased by the yard from some London bookseller who specialized in furnishing the libraries of those who read nothing whatsoever. The desk was an imposing mahogany affair, its surface clear save for an inkwell, a fountain pen, and a single sheet of writing paper that bore only a date and the beginning of what appeared to be a letter. The Honourable Henrietta Marchmont lay in a velvet wingback chair positioned near the window, her small form arranged with the sort of careful dignity that only the recently deceased could achieve. She had been, Peter surmised, from the slack features and the faint discoloration beginning at the extremities, dead for approximately 12 hours. Perhaps a touch more, depending upon the temperature of the room and the particular robustness of her constitution. Her hands were folded in her lap with a neatness that struck Peter as either the work of the servants who had discovered her or evidence of a personality so rigidly controlled that even death could not dishevel it. Her face bore no obvious expression of pain or fear. If anything, she appeared merely bored, as though she had fallen asleep mid-yawn and simply forgotten to wake. She was dressed in a grey woolen dress of impeccable tailoring, and Peter noted with interest that the hem of her skirt had been recently mended. The stitching was fresh, the thread still bearing that peculiar brightness of recent needlework, quite distinct from the faded repairs elsewhere on the garment. He filed this detail away with the same careful attention he might have devoted to a particularly cryptic crossword clue, understanding instinctively that it meant something, though precisely what remained obscure. "The doctor has been?" Peter inquired, turning his attention from the deceased to the room itself, moving about it with the casual interest of a man examining a painting in a gallery rather than surveying the scene of a probable crime. "This morning," Marchmont confirmed, hovering in the doorway as though reluctant to enter further. He suggested that her heart simply failed. She had always been fragile, you understand, delicate nerves, prone to headaches, eternally complaining of some fatigue or other. The doctor said it was entirely plausible that— Yes, Peter interrupted gently. "I understand the medical assessment. Tell me, did your wife typically spend her afternoons in this study? Was it her habit to lock herself away at this particular hour?" Marchmont considered this. She kept to her routine quite religiously. Tea in the morning room at 10, luncheon at 1, and then she would retire here until dinner. She was working on a manuscript, you see, a history of the Marchmont family, frightfully tedious business, genealogy, but Henrietta was quite devoted to it. Peter moved to the desk and examined the single sheet of writing paper with the focused attention of a jeweler examining a particularly suspect diamond. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical in its regularity. October 22nd, 1934. "My dearest Margaret, I find myself in the most extraordinary circumstances." The letter terminated abruptly, mid-sentence, and Peter carefully replaced it precisely where it had lain. "She was writing to someone named Margaret?" I'm not entirely certain," Marchmont said, and Peter detected in his voice the particular strain that comes from a man attempting to recall details he has not previously considered important. "She had friends in London, of course, several of them. She corresponded extensively." Peter turned to examine the bookshelf, running his finger along the spines with deliberate slowness. "Your wife's manuscript, This history of the Marchmonts, where would one find the manuscript itself? Surely not among these decorative volumes. In the desk, I should imagine. She kept her papers in the locked drawer. Peter opened the desk drawers with Marchmont's permission, or rather, without waiting for it to be explicitly withdrawn, and found himself confronted with the typical detritus of domestic correspondence and personal documents. Bills, letters from solicitors, a few scattered family photographs, and a bundle of handwritten pages tied together with a silk ribbon. He extracted the bundle and examined the top page, which bore the title The Marchmont Chronicles, a Fam. Ely narrative in the same precise handwriting as the unfinished letter. He set the manuscript aside and continued his examination of the drawer, noting the small brass key that hung from a hook inside the drawer itself, clearly meant to secure it, though it had not been locked when he opened it. Curious, Peter murmured, that one would maintain a locked drawer and yet leave the key so readily accessible. Suggests either remarkable confidence in one's household's honesty or a certain indifference to privacy. Tell me, Mr. Marchmont, was your wife the sort of woman to whom privacy was of paramount importance? Marchmont shifted his weight uncomfortably. Well, she kept her correspondence rather private, as most women do, but the servants are entirely trustworthy. We have had most of them for years. Peter turned to face the window, noting the latch and the absence of any scratches or forcing marks upon the frame. The window was closed, I presume. Locked, perhaps. Of course. It was October, and besides... Marchmont paused. Besides, we are on the second floor. There would be no access from outside. Peter smiled then, a small private expression that suggested he had just confirmed something he had long suspected. He moved back to the chair where Henrietta remained in her eternal repose, and, with the casual delicacy of a man rearranging flowers, he lifted the hem of her grey skirt slightly, examining the interior of the seam with the focused attention of a tailor inspecting his own work. The stitching was identical in type and age to that on the exterior, fresh within the last day or two, certainly, but the thread was a slightly different colour, suggesting that the mending had been done in somewhat haste, perhaps in less than ideal light. He released the fabric gently and straightened, his expression having shifted into something altogether more serious. I think, H., he said quietly, that I should like to speak with the servants, beginning with whoever discovered Mrs. Marchmont this morning. And afterward, I believe I shall require a very strong whisky and considerably more information regarding the precise nature of your wife's correspondence with this Margaret person. Would that be agreeable? The servants' hall at Thornfield Manor occupied that particular nether region of domestic space that exists in the architecture of country houses, specifically to ensure that the working classes remain invisible to their betters until such time as their labour is required. It was a room of surprising cheerfulness given its subterranean location, pale yellow walls and a generous window that faced onto the kitchen gardens, but it carried that indefinable atmosphere of regulated gaiety that characterizes institutions where laughter is permitted only at prescribed intervals. Mrs. Hendricks, the head housekeeper, was a woman of perhaps 60 years, with the bearing of someone who had spent her entire life enforcing standards of cleanliness and comportment with the zealousness of a military commander defending a frontier. She sat across from Peter in the small parlour reserved for staff interviews, her hands folded in her substantial lap, and recounted the discovery of Mrs. Marchmont's body with a sort of clinical precision that suggested she had already repeated the account several times to the local constabulary. It was she who had knocked upon the study door at 7:30, bearing the afternoon tea service, a ritual observed with such regularity that she could have set a clock by Mrs. Marchmont's summons. When no response came to her knock, she had waited precisely 5 minutes before knocking again, as protocol dictated. The second knock having yielded similar silence, she had taken the liberty of trying the door handle, found it locked, and immediately summoned Mr. Marchmont from the drawing-room. Peter listened to this recitation, with his chin propped thoughtfully upon his steepled fingers, interrupting occasionally to ask questions of such apparent triviality that Mrs. Hendricks seemed uncertain whether she was being interrogated or humoured. "The tea service," Peter said, gesturing vaguely in the direction from which he presumed the kitchen lay. It was prepared at what hour precisely? And by whom? Mrs. Hendricks stiffened slightly. The tea was prepared at 6:30, as it always was, by the second housemaid, Rose Twiggs. It was then conveyed to Mrs. Marchmont's study at precisely 7:30, as it always was, and left upon the small table beside her chair when no response came to my knock. You did not attempt to open the door yourself? You simply left the tea upon a table outside a locked study? Certainly not, sir. I knocked twice, waited an appropriate interval, and then summoned the master. It would not be my place to presume that your employer might be in need of assistance despite the locked door. Yes, I understand the logic of domestic hierarchy. Most admirable, though occasionally inconvenient when one happens to be dying on the other side of a locked portal. Tell me, had Mrs. Marchmont ever locked her study door before? This question seemed to trouble Mrs. Hendricks. Not that I am aware of, sir. She was particular about her privacy, naturally, but she had never actually locked the door. It was understood that we were not to disturb her during her afternoon work. Peter rose and moved to the window, observing the kitchen gardens below with an air of polite disinterest. And this Rose Twiggs, she is still in the household's employ. I should very much like to speak with her. Rose Twiggs proved to be a thin girl of perhaps 20 years, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she had been raised on too much strong tea and insufficient rest. She confirmed Mrs. Hendricks's account of the tea's preparation, adding the detail that she had been sent by the cook to fetch hot water from the kettle at precisely 6:30, having been specifically instructed to do so by Mrs. Hendricks, who maintained strict adherence to the household schedule. Peter inquired whether Mrs. Marchmont had ever made specific requests regarding the tea service, particular preparations, special additions, anything that might have distinguished this afternoon from any other. Rose shook her head emphatically, but then hesitated, a small furrow appearing between her eyebrows as though she were attempting to retrieve something from the depths of her memory. "There was one thing, sir," she said slowly. "Last week, Mrs. Marchmont asked me to bring her some warm milk in the evening, said her nerves were troubling her, and she wanted something to help her sleep. It was unusual, as the master always takes his evening drink in the drawing-room, and Mrs. Marchmont doesn't usually trouble the kitchen staff after dinner service is concluded. And did you bring her the milk?" "Yes, sir. Every evening for 3 days. Then she said she didn't need it anymore." Peter settled back in his chair, with the air of a man who had just heard something of considerable interest disguised as a minor household detail. How very curious. And was this milk prepared in any particular manner? With any additions, honey, perhaps, or a touch of brandy? "Just warm milk, sir, though cook did mention that it seemed wasteful, as Mrs. Marchmont left almost all of it untouched in the cup when I came to collect the tray the next morning." This exchange having concluded, Peter instructed Rose to remain available for further questioning and requested to see both the housekeeper's private quarters and the kitchen. The kitchen proved to be a disappointment, a thoroughly modern affair installed some 10 years prior, according to Mrs. Hendricks' rather proud recitation. But the housekeeper's sitting room revealed itself as something far more interesting. It was a small space, scrupulously organized, with a writing desk positioned beneath the window, and a shelf containing what appeared to be domestic accounts and household records. Peter examined these with theatrical interest, commenting upon the admirable neatness of the entries until Mrs. Hendricks, clearly gratified by this recognition of her diligence, ventured to show him the particular ledger in which the household expenses were recorded. It was while examining this document that Peter's eye fell upon an entry from the previous month, a notation regarding the purchase of a new lock mechanism for the study door. The entry read simply, "New lock fitted to study door, October 3rd, PS 2.10s. Peter looked up from the ledger with an expression of polite inquiry. "I am curious, Mrs. Hendricks, as to why a new lock would be required for a door that, according to your own account, Mrs. Marchmont had never previously locked. Was there a particular reason for this modification?" Mrs. Hendricks' face seemed to fold inward slightly, as though she had just been asked to explain something she had never truly considered. "The master ordered it, sir. He said the old lock had become unreliable, that it tended to stick. He wanted a new one installed for Mrs. Marchmont's convenience, so she could secure her private papers if she wished. Peter closed the ledger with deliberate care. How very considerate of him. And did Mrs. Marchmont make use of this new lock? Did she express satisfaction with the modification? I'm not certain, sir. She never mentioned it to me. Peter smiled, a thin expression that reached his eyes but did not extend. To warmth. How fascinating. I think, Mrs. Hendricks, that I shall now require the opportunity to examine that lock in greater detail, and perhaps I shall also need to speak with whoever installed it. But first, I believe I should like to have that conversation with Mr. Marchmont regarding his wife's correspondence. The one to Margaret, you understand. I find myself increasingly curious about the contents of that unfinished letter and the nature of the communication it represented. The drawing-room at Thornfield Manor presented itself as a study in muted opulence, the sort of space where conversation was expected to remain at a civilized murmur, and furniture had been arranged with mathematical precision to discourage intimate discourse. Peter found Crispin Marchmont standing before the fireplace, a whiskey glass cradled in his hand with the protective intensity of a man clinging to his last remaining comfort. The evening had descended with the peculiar swiftness of autumn in Yorkshire, transforming the windows into sheets of reflective black that rendered the room's interior all the more isolated and theatrical. Peter settled himself into a wing-back chair with studied casualness and accepted the drink that Marchmont hastily offered, remarking upon its excellence with a sort of sincere appreciation that seemed to reassure his host that conversation might proceed without immediate descent into accusation or recrimination. For several minutes they engaged in the pleasantries that characterize English social intercourse. Observations about the weather, comments upon the lateness of the season, a careful discussion of the local hunting prospects, before Peter introduced, with the delicacy of a man placing a loaded revolver upon a tea-table, the matter of Margaret. Your wife, Peter began, appears to have been in the process of writing a letter to someone named Margaret. At the moment of her death. The letter was discovered upon her desk, incomplete, beginning with certain expressions of endearment that suggest a correspondence of some emotional significance. I confess myself curious about the identity of this Margaret and the nature of the association that prompted your wife to address her with such evident warmth. The effect of this inquiry upon Crispin Marchmont was immediate and rather theatrical. His face underwent a transformation of such rapidity that Peter found himself marveling at the efficiency with which fear and indignation could occupy the same features. He stood abruptly, his whiskey glass forgotten upon the mantelpiece, and his voice, when he spoke, carried an edge of something that might have been anger or might have been something considerably more complex. I hardly see what business it is of yours, what business it is of anyone's, concerning my wife's private correspondence. Henrietta was entitled to her friendships, her associations. Of course she was, Peter interrupted smoothly, and I am not suggesting otherwise. I am merely attempting to establish the full scope of your wife's daily existence, her relationships, her interests, the 1,000 small threads that comprise a life and that so often illuminate the circumstances of its termination. Margaret is clearly someone of importance to her, someone with whom she maintained sufficient intimacy that she felt compelled to write to her even upon the very afternoon of her death. This suggests either remarkable dedication to correspondence or some matter of particular urgency that demanded immediate communication. I find myself wondering which it was. Marchmont resumed his seat, with the air of a man being forced to accept an unpleasant necessity. Margaret was Henrietta's sister, my wife's younger sister, living in London. They were devoted to one another despite the distance that separated them. It was entirely natural that Henrietta should write to her regularly. Peter raised an eyebrow with the sort of theatrical precision that suggested he found this revelation interesting, primarily for what it failed to explain. Her sister, how very affecting. And yet you made no mention of this Margaret earlier when I inquired about the letter. One might have thought that a letter from a dying woman to her beloved sister would be a detail worth mentioning without prompting, rather than allowing me to discover it through the rather pedestrian method of finding the letter upon her desk. Tell me, Mr. Marchmont, why did this particular correspondence strike you as something to be withheld from my inquiry?" Marchmont's hands had begun to tremble again, and he clasped them together with obvious effort. "There was nothing withheld. I did not recall the letter immediately. My mind has been in considerable turmoil since Henrietta's death, and the details—" Of course," Peter said, his tone suggesting that he believed this explanation not in the slightest. "Grief is invariably confusing and exhausting. Tell me, when did your wife's sister last visit Thornfield, and how would you characterize the relationship between Henrietta and this Margaret? Were they close, or was their affection the sort of distant thing that siblings sometimes maintain despite having very little in common?" "They were quite close," Marchmont said, though the words seemed to come with difficulty. "Margaret visited perhaps twice yearly. They corresponded regularly, as I mentioned. Henrietta valued her sister's opinion on matters both trivial and serious." Peter rose and moved to the mantelpiece, examining the collection of photographs arranged there with the interest of an archaeologist examining artifacts. There were images of Crispin as a young man, STI, postured and uncomfortable before the camera, a wedding photograph featuring Henrietta in white lace, her expression suggesting she was enduring rather than celebrating the occasion, several country scenes and family groupings. But notably absent was any photograph of a young woman who might reasonably have been identified as Margaret. Peter turned back to face Marchmont with an expression of mild inquiry. "Your wife's sister does not appear to have been immortalized in photographs here at Thornfield. This strikes me as curious, given the evident closeness of their relationship. Surely Margaret must have visited with sufficient regularity that one might expect to find some visual record of her presence?" "Photography was never Margaret's great enthusiasm," Marchmont said, and Peter detected in his tone the particular quality of desperation that comes from a man constructing explanations too rapidly to ensure their coherence. "She was rather camera-shy, as some people are. How inconvenient for her," Peter observed. He moved toward the window and gazed out into the darkness, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "I find myself wondering, Mr. Marchmont, whether you might not provide me with your wife's sister's address in London. I should like to write to her, or better still, perhaps to telephone her, to express my condolences and to inquire whether she might possess any information regarding your wife's state of mind in the days preceding her death. These family connections are often illuminating in matters of this sort, and I should not wish to overlook any avenue of investigation, however seemingly peripheral." The silence that followed this request was profound and distinctly uncomfortable. When Marchmont finally spoke, his voice had become very quiet, and the words seemed to cost him considerable effort. I am afraid that Margaret is not currently available for such communication. She has taken a position abroad, in Brussels, I believe, and her whereabouts are somewhat uncertain at present." Peter turned from the window to face his host directly, and the expression upon his face suggested that he had just heard confirmation of something he had long suspected but had hoped to be proven wrong about. "How very convenient," he said softly, "that your wife's beloved sister should have removed herself from England at a time when your wife appears to have been writing to her in some urgency. Tell me, Mr. Marchmont, precisely when did Margaret depart for the continent, and under what circumstances did she arrange this rather abrupt removal?" Crispin Marchmont's composure, which had been deteriorating with admirable consistency throughout Peter's interrogation, now appeared to undergo something approaching complete systemic failure. He rose from his chair with such abruptness that it scraped audibly against the parquet flooring, and his face had assumed a pallor that made him appear considerably older than his years. When he spoke, his voice emerged in a hoarse whisper that suggested his throat had become considerably drier in the past few minutes. "I fail to see what Margaret's circumstances have to do with Henrietta's death. My wife's sister made the perfectly reasonable decision to accept a position abroad, a governess position, if you must know, and that has nothing whatsoever to do with the tragedy that has befallen my household." Peter resumed his seat with deliberate slowness, arranging himself in the chair with the meticulous care of a man settling in for a conversation that might extend well into the evening. "A governess position," he repeated thoughtfully, as though considering this information in relation to some internal calculation. "How very particular. One does not often encounter young English women of your wife's family. And I presume Margaret to be younger, given the phrasing of their correspondence. Accepting positions as governesses abroad, such work is typically undertaken by women whose circumstances are somewhat constrained, whose families are not in a position to support them in greater comfort. This strikes me as curious in light of the evident prosperity that surrounds us here at Thornfield. Tell me, was Margaret's financial situation such that she required employment of this nature? Or was there perhaps some other reason for her rather precipitous departure from England?" Marchmont had begun to pace the room in that particular manner, adopted by caged animals and guilty men, a repetitive circuit from the window to the mantelpiece and back again that seemed to provide no comfort whatsoever. "Margaret and I have never been particularly close," he said, the words emerging with the quality of a confession being wrung from an unwilling penitent. She was always something of a disappointment to the family. Not precisely unsuitable, you understand, but lacking in the sort of social graces and accomplishments that one expects in a young woman of reasonable family. Her appearance was never particularly striking, and her temperament was inclined toward the bookish rather than the social. When the opportunity for the governess position arose, it seemed a reasonable solution to a rather awkward situation. "An awkward situation," Peter repeated, his tone suggesting that this phrase had suddenly acquired significance it had not previously possessed. How intriguingly vague. "I confess I find myself most eager to understand the precise nature of this awkwardness. Was it financial, social, or was it perhaps something rather more specific, something that made her continued presence in England undesirable for reasons that extended beyond the mere matter of her lack of social accomplishment?" "And—" Marchmont stopped his pacing and turned to face Peter with an expression of such profound weariness that he appeared to have aged a decade in the space of their conversation. "You must understand that these matters are intensely private, Wimsey. They concern family honor, reputation, things that matter very little to men of your particular standing, but which carry considerable weight in circles such as ours." "I understand perfectly," Peter said, his tone suggesting that understanding and sympathy were not necessarily synonymous. "However, I find myself operating under the rather pressing necessity of determining how your wife came to be dead in a locked study, and I have discovered that matters of family honor and reputation so often serve as the most effective camouflage for considerably more sinister circumstances. So I should appreciate it if you would abandon this rather transparent attempt at discretion and explain to me precisely what awkward situation made it necessary for your wife's sister to remove herself from England in what I am increasingly convinced was considerable haste." For a long moment Marchmont remained silent, his gaze fixed upon the fire that burned in the hearth with the sort of intensity one might expect from a man watching his entire world consume itself in flames. When he finally spoke, his voice had become almost inaudible. Margaret became involved with someone unsuitable, a man of considerably lower social standing, a clerk in a solicitor's office, nothing more. Henrietta discovered the correspondence between them and was, quite naturally, horrified. The situation threatened to become public, and the scandal would have been ruinous to both girls' prospects. Arrangements were made, discreet arrangements, for Margaret to accept the governess position and to remove herself from England before the matter could escalate into something more damaging. Peter rose and moved to the decanter of whiskey that stood upon the sideboard, refilling both his own glass and Marchmont's with the air of a man who had just determined that the conversation ahead would benefit from the lubrication of alcohol. "And this clerk," he inquired, "did he follow her to Brussels? Or did his ardor cool once she had removed herself beyond convenient reach?" I'm not entirely certain of his current whereabouts," Marchmont said, accepting the refilled glass with trembling fingers. Margaret wrote to Henrietta occasionally, but she was always somewhat circumspect in her communications. Henrietta understood that her sister wished to make a fresh start, and she respected that desire. "How very noble of her," Peter observed, settling once more into his chair. "And yet the letter discovered upon her desk yesterday afternoon suggests that Henrietta had become possessed of some information that was causing her considerable distress. The opening lines, I find myself in the most extraordinary circumstances, suggests something rather more urgent than mere nostalgia for a wayward sister. Tell me, Mr. Marchmont, had your wife received any communication from Margaret within the past week? Any letter or telegram that might have prompted this particular missive? Marchmont's face had become a study in barely suppressed panic. There was a letter, he admitted, the words emerging as though each one cost him considerable effort. It arrived on Monday. Henrietta seemed quite distressed when she read it, but she refused to discuss its contents with me. She merely said that she had some thinking to do and that she required time alone. And you did not press her for further information? You did not insist upon understanding the contents of correspondence that had caused your wife such evident distress? Henrietta valued her privacy, Marchmont said. But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. I respected her wishes in such matters. Peter set down his whiskey glass with deliberate precision. I think, Mr. Marchmont, that what you are attempting to convey, in your rather delicate fashion, is that you feared the contents of that letter, and that you did not press your wife for information because you were afraid of what that information might reveal. I further suspect that this Monday letter contained news regarding Margaret that was sufficiently shocking to motivate your wife to begin writing what appears to have been either a confession or an explanation. Is this a reasonable assessment of the situation? Marchmont did not respond, but his silence was answer enough. The silence that extended between them acquired that particular quality that comes from a confession being acknowledged without words, and Peter allowed it to persist for precisely the duration necessary for Crispin Marchmont to become thoroughly uncomfortable with its weight. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that specific timbre of a man who has decided that further resistance is not merely futile, but counterproductive. The letter, he said slowly, contained information that Henrietta found deeply troubling. Margaret wrote that she had made a terrible mistake, that the man she had followed to Brussels was not what she had believed him to be, that he had, in fact, deceived her regarding his intentions and his character. She was— He paused, seeming to struggle with the words as though they were physical objects lodged in his throat. She was with child, whimsy. Margaret was expecting a child, and the man responsible had abandoned her. She was writing to Henrietta in a state of considerable desperation, asking for assistance, for advice, for some means of extricating herself from an impossible situation. Peter processed this informatio with the methodical precision of a man arranging pieces upon a chessboard, considering the implications and the connections that this revelation suggested. And how did your wife respond to this news? Did she consult you? Did she propose some course of action? She did not consult me, Marchmont said bitterly. She locked herself in that study and refused to speak with me for the remainder of the evening and throughout the following day. I attempted to discuss the matter with her on Tuesday morning, but she would not hear me. She said only that she needed to think, that she could not yet determine what ought to be done, and that she required time to consider the proper course of action. And then on Tuesday afternoon, at precisely 6:30, she took warm milk prepared by Rose Twiggs, locked herself in her study, and was discovered dead at 7:30, Peter said, his tone suggesting that he was merely reciting facts for confirmation. Tell me, Mr. Marchmont, what precisely was in that warm milk? And please do not insult my intelligence by suggesting it contained nothing more than milk, and perhaps a touch of honey. The effect of this direct accusation was to drain the remaining color from Marchmont's face, leaving him appearing distinctly cadaverous in the firelight. He sank into his chair as though his legs had been cut from beneath him, and when he spoke, his voice emerged as little more than a whisper. I did not, Henrietta did not. He stopped, seeming to recognize the futility of further denial. She asked for it herself. She said she wanted something to help her sleep, something to quiet her nerves. She said the situation with Margaret was causing her such distress that she could not rest, and she needed something to ease her mind. She asked you for something to help her sleep, Peter repeated softly, and you provided her with what, precisely? So, me form of sedative. A sleeping draught of your own creation, or perhaps procured from some less than scrupulous source. It was nothing more than a mild tincture, Marchmont said, the words tumbling out with desperate rapidity. Something her physician had prescribed for her some years ago, when she was troubled by insomnia. It was perfectly harmless, merely laudanum in solution, mixed with the milk to make it palatable. Nothing that would cause harm to a healthy woman. Nothing that would cause immediate harm, Peter interrupted, but rather something that, when combined with certain other factors, might induce a state of profound unconsciousness from which an individual might not awaken. Tell me, Mr. Marchmont, did you yourself prepare this milk on Tuesday afternoon, or did you instruct someone else to do so? Marchmont's silence was deafening, and Peter found himself watching with the fascination of an entomologist observing a particularly complex specimen as the man before him underwent the final stages of complete psychological collapse. I told Rose to prepare the milk, Marchmont said finally, his voice barely audible. I told her to add the tincture that I had left upon the kitchen shelf. I said it was for Henrietta's nerves. I did not tell her how much to add. I could not have known. You could not have known that your wife would drink the entire quantity of milk rather than leaving most of it untouched in the cup, as she had done on previous occasions? Peter asked, his tone carrying a cutting edge of irony. Or you could not have known that whatever you had added to that milk would prove sufficient to render her unconscious, or indeed to prove fatal under the precise circumstances in which it was consumed? I never intended her harm, Marchmont said, and the desperation in his voice carried the particular quality of a man attempting to convince himself of a proposition in which he had ceased to believe. I merely wanted her to rest, to cease worrying about Margaret's situation, to eliminate the possibility that she would take some action regarding Margaret that would prove inconvenient or damaging to your interests, Peter finished coldly. You knew, did you not, that your wife intended to assist her sister? That she was preparing to confess the entire situation to someone, perhaps her solicitor, perhaps her physician, and that she was preparing to arrange for Margaret to be brought back to England where the situation could be resolved through proper legal and familial channels rather than through the sort of discretion and silence that you preferred? Marchmont did not respond, and Peter rose to his feet with the air of a man who has concluded that a particular conversation has reached its natural terminus. I think, he said quietly, that I shall now require the services of the local constabulary. Specifically, I shall require them to examine the contents of that milk bottle that was left upon the kitchen shelf, and to obtain a detailed account from Rose Twiggs regarding the precise quantity of tincture she added to the milk at your instruction. I suspect they will find that the quantity was considerably in excess of what any physician would have recommended for a mere sleeping draught. I further suspect that you had calculated this excess with considerable precision, banking upon the assumption that when a locked room contains a dead woman and a locked door, the obvious conclusion will be either natural death or suicide, rather than a more deliberate form of elimination. Peter moved toward the door with the unhurried grace of a man who knows himself to possess complete command of the situation. You have been exceptionally foolish, Mr. Marchmont, not merely in the act itself, though T was foolish indeed, but in the manner in which you have conducted your deception. A man who truly believed his wife had died of natural causes would not have hidden the details of her correspondence with her sister. A man who truly believed his wife had taken her own life would not have lied about the warm milk and its contents. You have convicted yourself through the simple expedient of attempting to conceal the very circumstances that would have rendered your guilt apparent to anyone with even a modicum of investigative acumen. The mended hem upon your wife's dress, the freshly installed lock upon her study door, the careful specification of the timing of the milk service. All of these details pointed toward a crime that was not one of violence but of deliberate deception and calculated cruelty. Your wife discovered that her sister required assistance, and you could not permit that assistance to be rendered because it might have resulted in scandal or inconvenience. So you eliminated her, as efficiently and quietly as one might eliminate an inconvenient problem in a ledger. The constabulary arrived at Thornfield Manor at 9:30 that evening, summoned by telephone through the agency of a local constable, who had remained at the house pending further developments. Inspector Bradshaw was a man of perhaps 50 years, possessed of that particular species of provincial competence that characterizes rural law enforcement. thorough in his methods if not brilliant, and sufficiently experienced to recognize when his initial assessments of a case had been rendered obsolete by subsequent revelations. He listened to Peter's account of the evening's conversation with an expression of gradually deepening concern, and when Peter had concluded his explanation, Bradshaw permitted himself a long, low whistle that suggested his entire understanding of the case had been fundamental. Tally restructured. "You're telling me," Bradshaw said slowly, "that Marchmont deliberately administered a fatal dose of laudanum to his wife, disguised it as a sleeping draught, and then locked the door from the inside to create the appearance of suicide or natural death. That's a considerable leap from what we initially observed." "It is indeed," Peter agreed, "but the evidence, when properly assembled, points toward that conclusion with remarkable consistency. The lock itself is illuminating. A new installation ordered by Marchmont specifically to give his wife the means to secure the room from within. He would have had the opportunity to examine its mechanism during the installation and to ensure that it could be manipulated from the outside, either by means of a concealed key or through some mechanical trick known only to himself. The milk service provides the mechanism, warm liquid consumed immediately before her death sufficient to mask any unusual taste or odor. The timing is precise. 6:30 for preparation, 7:30 for discovery, ensuring that rigor mortis and other post-mortem phenomena would not begin to manifest until several hours had elapsed, during which time the initial medical examination would conclude natural causes. Inspector Bradshaw's jaw had tightened considerably. "And this business with the sister, Margaret, was it? That's genuine, then. The woman truly is in Brussels with an illegitimate child." "Almost certainly," Peter said, moving toward the window where the Yorkshire darkness pressed against the glass like something sentient and watchful. "What is interesting is that Marchmont's initial account of her departure contained a kernel of truth wrapped around a substantial core of deception. Margaret did indeed leave England under circumstances that might reasonably be described as hurried. She did become involved with an unsuitable man. But the governess position in Brussels was likely a fiction constructed to provide Henrietta with a satisfactory explanation for her sister's absence. Margaret's actual circumstances were considerably more desperate. Abandoned by her lover and pregnant with his child, she would have been forced to seek some form of assistance. When she finally wrote to her sister, it was not in the expectant tone of a wayward young woman seeking forgiveness, but rather in the desperate tone of a woman facing ruin and requiring immediate practical help. Bradshaw made notes in a small leather-bound notebook, with the mechanical precision of a man performing an action that had become so habitual it required no conscious thought. Marchmont must have known that his wife would attempt to assist her sister. "They were close, you said?" "Very close, according to all accounts," Peter confirmed. Henrietta received the letter from Margaret on Monday and spent the remainder of that day and all of Tuesday in a state of considerable distress, attempting to determine what assistance she could render. She wrote the letter we discovered, the one beginning, "I find myself in the most extraordinary circumstances," in an attempt to articulate to Margaret some course of action that might resolve the situation with a minimum of scandal. But Marchmont recognized that any assistance his wife might render would inevitably come to light, and he could not permit that. His wife's compassion for her sister threatened something that he valued considerably more: his social position, his reputation, the careful facade of respectability that he had constructed around himself. "So he poisoned her," Bradshaw said flatly, and Peter detected in his tone the particular disgust that comes from a man contemplating an act of premeditated cruelty masquerading as a solution to domestic inconvenience. He gave her something that he believed would appear as natural death, and would thereby resolve his problem without requiring him to take any active role in its resolution. "Precisely so," Peter said. He was counting upon the appearance of suicide or natural death to prevent any serious investigation. A woman found dead in a locked study, with no signs of violence and a history of delicate health, such circumstances rarely prompt the sort of rigorous examination that this case has received. He had removed the most obvious obstacle to achieving his preferred outcome by ordering the installation of the new lock, which provided him with the means to create the locked room scenario that he believed would preclude serious suspicion. At this juncture, Constable Davies appeared in the doorway with an expression suggesting that he had brought news of considerable import. "We've found the bottle, sir," he reported to Inspector Bradshaw. "In the kitchen, exactly where Mr. Marchmont indicated. Rose Twiggs confirms that she added the tincture at Mr. Marchmont's specific instruction, though she says he told her it was merely a mild sedative and that Mrs. Marchmont had requested it specifically for her nerves. She states that she added approximately a tablespoon of the tincture to the milk, as Mr. Marchmont instructed, though she remarks that he seemed rather particular about the measurement and insisted upon watching her add it." Peter nodded slowly, as though this revelation confirmed something he had already determined through his own processes of deduction. He was ensuring that the dosage was sufficient, he said quietly. He could not risk the possibility that an insufficient quantity might merely render his wife unconscious, rather than achieving the permanent unconsciousness of death. The question now becomes whether he had deliberately calculated this dosage, or whether he was relying upon what he hoped would be a fortuitous accident, a quantity sufficient to prove fatal in combination with whatever other factors were present that evening. "There's something else," Constable Davies said, hesitating slightly as though uncertain whether his next revelation was relevant. "We spoke with the locksmith who installed the new lock on the study door. He says that Mr. Marchmont was extremely particular about examining the mechanism after installation, asking numerous questions about how it functioned and whether it was possible to manipulate it from the outside under certain circumstances. The locksmith thought it odd at the time, but assumed Mr. Marchmont was merely concerned about security." Inspector Bradshaw exchanged a glance with Peter that required no words to communicate a shared understanding. He was learning how to operate the lock from outside, Bradshaw said grimly. He was preparing for the possibility that he might need to lock the door after administering the poison, to create the appearance that his wife had locked herself in, or, Peter said, his tone carrying that particular quality of irony that characterized his speech when discussing human folly, he was simply ensuring that he understood the mechanism thoroughly enough to convince himself that his plan was feasible. Murder, Inspector, is so often committed by men who are considerably more intelligent than they are wise, and who therefore construct a labor. 8 schemes to accomplish what might have been achieved through far simpler means. Marchmont's fatal error was in believing that intelligence and careful planning could transform an act of fundamentally cowardly cruelty into something that resembled rational problem-solving. The hours that followed proceeded with the mechanical inevitability of a legal machinery that, once set in motion, could not be halted or redirected by anything so insubstantial as human emotion or domestic tragedy. Inspector Bradshaw conducted his interviews with Crispin Marchmont in the study itself, a choice that Peter recognized as possessing a certain theatrical quality, ensuring that the accused man would be forced to sit in the very room where his wife had died, surrounded by the physical evidence of his crime. The constable took possession of the milk bottle and its remaining contents, arranging for its transport to a medical examiner in Leeds who could analyze the precise composition and potency of the laudanum solution. Rose Twiggs was questioned at length regarding her recollection of the quantity she had added and Marchmont's demeanor during the process, and her testimony was recorded in meticulous detail by a police stenographer who had been summoned from the nearest town. By midnight, Crispin Marchmont had been formally charged with the murder of his wife, Henrietta Margaret Marchmont, and arrangements were being made for his transport to York, where he would be held pending trial. Peter observed all of this with the detached interest of a man watching a theatrical production whose denouement he had already anticipated. He sat in the small study off the library, nursing a particularly excellent brandy that Bradshaw had magnanimously provided, and reflected upon the curious psychology that had motivated Marchmont to commit so catastrophic an error in judgment. It was not, he reflected, the ignorance of common men that so often led to their destruction, but rather the educated presumption of gentlemen of moderate intelligence who believed themselves possessed of sufficient cleverness to manipulate circumstances to their advantage. Marchmont had possessed just enough knowledge of poison and toxicology to believe himself capable of administering a fatal dose while making it appear accidental. He had understood enough about locked rooms and their implications to construct what he believed to be an impenetrable alibi, but he had failed to account for the 1,000 small details that collectively comprise the forensic reality of a crime. The mended hem that suggested Henrietta had been preparing for something, the timing of the lock's installation that placed Marchmont in proximity to the mechanism at precisely the moment when he would have been learning its secrets, the careful observation of Rose Twiggs regarding the precise manner in which he had insisted upon watching the tincture being added to the milk. Inspector Bradshaw appeared in the doorway some time after 1 in the morning, his uniform rumpled and his expression carrying the exhaustion of a man who had spent several hours attempting to extract coherent explanations from a suspect whose mental state was rapidly deteriorating. "He's admitted everything," Bradshaw said without preamble, settling himself into the chair opposite Peter with the air of a man whose legs could no longer support him. "Confessed within the hour, once he realized that we had the bottle, and Rose Twiggs's testimony regarding the dosage. He says he never intended to kill her, merely to render her unconscious long enough for the initial shock of learning about Margaret to wear off, and for him to convince her that assistance was impossible and that Margaret's situation would have to be accepted as the natural consequence of her OWN foolishness. A fantasy of extraordinary transparency, Peter observed, swirling his brandy thoughtfully. He could not possibly have believed that rendering his wife unconscious would somehow alter her fundamental character or her moral convictions. Henrietta struck me as a woman possessed of considerable strength of principle. The sort of woman who, once she had determined upon a course of action, could not be dissuaded from it through any means short of incapacitation or death. Which is, I suspect, precisely why Marchmont found himself compelled to resort to the latter solution. He claims he miscalculated the dosage, Bradshaw continued, and Peter detected in his tone the particular weariness of a man who has heard confessions that strain credulity to its breaking point. Says he obtained the laudanum from a chemist in York, claiming it was for his own use, and that he merely intended to add enough to ensure she would sleep through the evening. He maintains that the fatal outcome was accidental, the result of miscalculation rather than premeditation. Peter smiled, a thin expression that contained no warmth whatsoever. "How convenient," he said softly. A man orders a new lock installed on his wife's study door specifically to enable her to secure it from within. He learns the mechanism of that lock with sufficient precision to potentially manipulate it from the outside. He obtains a controlled substance from a source outside his usual circle of medical practitioners. He instructs the housemaid to add a specific quantity of that substance to his wife's milk, and he insists upon witnessing the process himself. And yet he maintains that the fatal outcome represents nothing more than a tragic miscalculation. "Inspector, I would submit to you that the quantity of laudanum required to merely render a woman unconscious is considerably less than the quantity required to prove fatal." Marchmont would have had considerable difficulty miscalculating in such a direction unless he were attempting to convince himself of a fiction he no longer truly believed. Bradshaw nodded wearily. "That's essentially what the medical examiner will argue once he's analyzed the bottle's contents. If the quantity of laudanum present is sufficiently concentrated to produce death rather than mere unconsciousness, the jury is unlikely to accept Marchmont's explanation of accidental miscalculation. But he's not admitting to premeditated murder. He's insisting it was an accident, a tragic consequence of his attempt to provide his wife with rest and relief from her anxieties, which places the legal question in an interesting position, Peter mused. The facts suggest deliberate poisoning with murderous intent, but the accused maintains that his intent was merely to sedate his wife, not to kill her. The prosecution will argue that the quantity of poison administered, combined with the deliberate installation of the lock and the calculated timing of the administration, constitutes sufficient evidence of premeditation to support a charge of murder. The defense will argue that even if one accepts the premise of intentional poisoning, the evidence regarding intent is circumstantial and subject to interpretation. "You don't believe his story about the miscalculation, then?" Bradshaw asked, though his tone suggested that he already knew the answer to this question. Peter set down his brandy glass with deliberate precision. I believe that Crispin Marchmont is a man who has discovered himself confronted by circumstances that threatened his carefully constructed sense of social order and propriety. I believe he was capable of committing murder to prevent those circumstances from becoming public. I believe the evidence strongly suggests that he did indeed commit that. Murder. But I also believe that he is now engaged in the very human process of attempting to convince himself that his actions were somehow less culpable than they actually were, that he was driven by circumstance rather than choice, by accident rather than intent. It is a fiction that will likely serve him poorly in a courtroom, but it may serve him somewhat better in the privacy of his own conscience, assuming he possesses the capacity for self-deception necessary to make such fiction convincing. The dawn that broke over Thornfield Manor on Wednesday morning arrived with the sort of indifferent brilliance that nature reserves for moments of human catastrophe, as though the sun had not received notification that tragedy had visited this particular corner of Yorkshire and therefore continued its appointed rounds with unseemly cheerfulness. Peter found himself awake at 6 o'clock, having abandoned the pretense of sleep sometime around 4, and he descended to the breakfast room where Mrs. Hendricks was conducting her morning rounds with the mechanical precision of a woman for whom routine had become the primary means of maintaining sanity. She provided him with eggs, bacon, and toast without comment, though her eyes carried the particular haunted quality of someone who had begun to comprehend the scope of the betrayal that had occurred within her household. Peter ate with methodical attention to detail, reading the morning edition of the Yorkshire Post, which had somehow already acquired knowledge of the previous evening's arrest, though the account was rendered in sufficiently vague language to suggest that Inspector Bradshaw had maintained at least a modicum of discretion regarding the specific details of the case. At 7:30, a telegram arrived addressed to Lord Peter Wimsey, and it bore the mark of the London Postal Service, indicating that it had been dispatched during the previous evening. Peter opened it with the curiosity of a man accustomed to receiving communications that ranged from the mundane to the melodramatic, and discovered within it a message from Bunter, his personal secretary and man of all work, indicating that a young woman of approximately 25 years had presented herself at Wimsey's London residence, requesting an urgent audience. The woman had declined to provide her name, but had insisted that her business was of considerable importance, and that it pertained to a family matter of delicate nature. Peter smiled at this, a thin expression that suggested he had anticipated precisely this development, and was gratified to discover that his expectations aligned with reality. He composed a reply instructing Bunter to provide the young woman with all reasonable comfort, and to assure her that Lord Peter would return to London by the following afternoon, at which time her concerns would receive his full and undivided attention. The remainder of the morning was devoted to ensuring that the loose ends of the investigation had been properly secured for the benefit of Inspector Bradshaw and the magistrate who would be conducting the preliminary hearing. Peter reviewed with Bradshaw the precise sequence of events as he understood them, ensuring that the constable possessed a coherent narrative that would withstand the inevitable scrutiny of a defense counsel determined to obscure rather than clarify. The medical examiner's preliminary findings confirmed that the laudanum concentration in the milk bottle was substantially in excess of what would be required for mere sedation, lending credence to the theory of deliberate and fatal poisoning. Rose Twiggs's testimony was recorded in written form, her recollection of Marchmont's insistence upon watching the tincture being added to the milk forming a cornerstone. Of the prosecution's case regarding premeditation, the locksmith confirmed that the new mechanism installed on the study door possessed certain peculiarities that would allow it to be manipulated from the outside by someone with knowledge of its construction, a detail that suggested Marchmont's extensive inquiries about the lock's operation had been motivated by considerably more than mere curiosity about domestic security. By midday, Peter had determined that his presence at Thornfield was no longer productive, and that the investigation had progressed to the point where the legal machinery could proceed without his further involvement. He packed his luggage with the assistance of a housemaid whose hands trembled slightly as she performed this task, suggesting that the servants had begun to process the implications of Marchmont's arrest and the destruction of the household in which they had been employed. His Aunt Helen had sent another telegram, this one containing instructions that he was to return to London immediately and that urgent family business required his attention, a phrasing that Peter recognized as code for something considerably more serious than the typical social obligations that normally occupied his time. He took his leave of Inspector Bradshaw at 1:30, offering that gentleman the sort of parting observations that characterize the interaction between an amateur detective of independent means and a professional constable whose authority and jurisdiction did not extend beyond the borders of Yorkshire. The drive to York and the subsequent train journey to London proceeded with the sort of mechanical efficiency that characterizes travel undertaken by men accustomed to moving through the landscape, with the detachment of those observing it through the window of a railway carriage, rather than truly inhabiting it. Peter arrived at his residence in Piccadilly at 6:30 on Thursday evening, and he was met in the entrance hall by Bunter, whose expression suggested that the young woman in question had exceeded even his considerable capacities for maintaining equanimity in the face of emotional distress. She was waiting in the sitting room, a slim figure of perhaps 25 years dressed in a traveling suit that bore signs of having been worn for considerably longer than was customary, and her face possessed that particular combination of fear and determination that characterizes individuals who have traveled considerable distances for purposes they are not entirely certain they understand. "Miss Margaret," Peter said, settling himself into the chair opposite her with the air of a man who had expected precisely this development and was merely confirming a foregone conclusion, "I am delighted to make your acquaintance. I confess I have been anticipating your arrival with considerable interest, though I must admit that I am somewhat surprised to discover you in London rather than Brussels. I suspect you have received some communication from your sister, or rather you have attempted to communicate with your sister and discovered that she is no longer in a position to respond to your correspondence. Might I offer you some tea? I believe Bunter has prepared a particularly excellent blend, and I suspect you may find yourself in need of its restorative properties before we embark upon what promises to be a conversation of considerable emotional and legal complexity." Margaret accepted the tea with trembling hands, and Peter observed that she possessed her sister's features rendered in a younger and considerably more vulnerable form, the same precise cheekbones, the same intelligent eyes, but lacking the particular hardness that experience and marriage had imparted to Henrietta's expression. She sipped the tea with the mechanical precision of someone performing an action that had been recommended without truly comprehending its necessity, and when she finally spoke, her voice emerged in a whisper that suggested she had been crying for an extended period and had only recently concluded this practice. "My sister is dead," she said, and it was not a question but a statement of fact delivered with the particular certainty of someone who had already undergone the process of accepting an impossible truth. "I received a telegram this morning from my brother-in-law informing me of her death. He said she had suffered a seizure of the heart, that she had died in her study, that there was nothing to be done. But I have known since the moment I received her last letter, that something was terribly wrong." Peter set down his own cup with deliberate care. "Tell me about that letter," he said quietly. "The one that prompted your sister to write to you on Monday last. The one that contained news sufficiently distressing to motivate her to lock herself away and to begin composing what appears to have been a confession or explanation of some considerable importance." Margaret's hands had begun to shake more severely, and she set down her teacup with evident difficulty. "I wrote to Henrietta approximately 2 weeks ago," she said, her words tumbling forth with the rapidity of a confession that could no longer be contained. "I told her that the situation in Brussels had become impossible, that the man I had followed there had abandoned me, that I was pregnant and utterly without resources. I asked her for assistance, for money to enable me to travel somewhere I might give birth in relative anonymity and arrange for the child to be placed with a family that could provide for it properly. I did not expect her to respond immediately, as I knew she would wish to consider the matter carefully and to determine what assistance might be possible without drawing undue attention to the family. And yet your sister did respond," Peter said, "and she did so with sufficient urgency to suggest that she had determined upon a course of action that she felt compelled to articulate immediately. Tell me, what precisely did Henrietta propose in her letter to you? What solution had she devised to address your situation?" Margaret drew a shaky breath, and tears began to stream down her face with a sort of steady inevitability of water seeping through a compromised dam. She proposed that I return to England immediately, Margaret said. She wrote that she had consulted with a solicitor regarding the legal implications of my situation, and that she believed it possible to arrange for the child to be placed in the care of a suitable family without requiring a complete separation between myself and my offspring. She suggested that she would provide financial support, that she would assist me in finding some form of employment or occupation that would permit me to maintain some connection to the child, while ensuring that the family providing care for it would be adequately compensated for their efforts. She wrote that she was determined to assist me, regardless of the scandal or difficulty that might result, and that she could not permit me to suffer in isolation when the matter might be resolved through honest engagement with our family and the proper legal authorities. Peter rose and moved to the window, gazing out into the London evening where the street lamps had begun to illuminate against the gathering darkness. "Your sister," he said quietly, "was a woman of considerable moral courage. She had determined that the proper course of action was to confront the situation directly, to seek legal and practical solutions, and to ensure that you were not abandoned to your circumstances because of fear of scandal. This determination, I am afraid, proved to be incompatible with your brother-in-law's preferences regarding how the matter ought to be handled." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, and Peter detected in her voice the first stirrings of comprehension that something far more sinister than a mere domestic tragedy had occurred. "You are suggesting that Crispin had something to do with Henrietta's death. That is impossible. He would never." "On the contrary," Peter interrupted gently, "your brother-in-law was entirely capable of such an action, and he was sufficiently motivated by fear of scandal and disruption to undertake it. You see, Miss Margaret, your situation represented a threat to everything that your brother-in-law valued: his social position, his reputation, his carefully maintained facade of respectability. Your sister's determination to assist you threatened to expose the family to precisely the sort of scandal that Crispin found unendurable. When he discovered that she was preparing to take action regardless of his preferences, he determined upon a solution that would eliminate the problem without requiring him to actively participate in any unseemly confrontation." Margaret's face had become ashen, and she gripped the arms of the chair with such force that her knuckles whitened. "You are saying that he murdered her, that he deliberately killed Henrietta to prevent her from assisting me?" "I am saying that the evidence strongly suggests precisely that," Peter confirmed. "He administered to your sister a fatal dose of laudanum, disguised as a sleeping draught, timed to take effect after he had left the study. He had previously arranged for the installation of a new lock on the study door, which he had examined with sufficient thoroughness to understand its mechanism. He created the appearance of suicide or natural death by ensu, ring that the door would be found locked from within, with your sister's body positioned to suggest she had merely fallen asleep and failed to awaken. He was depending upon the appearance of a locked room and a woman of delicate health to prevent any serious investigation into the circumstances of her death." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair clattering backward with the force of her movement. "Then I am responsible," she said, her voice rising to a pitch of anguish that suggested she was contemplating a truth she found unendurable. "My circumstances, my situation, my desperate letter, these things motivated him to commit this crime. If I had not written to her, if I had not asked for her assistance, she would still be alive." Peter turned from the window to face her directly, and his expression carried that particular combination of compassion and firmness that characterizes men accustomed to confronting individuals with truths they find unwelcome but necessary. "You are not responsible for your brother-in-law's actions," he said quietly but with absolute conviction. "You did not force him to commit murder. You did not compel him to choose elimination over honesty. Your brother-in-law made a deliberate choice to murder your sister rather than face the possibility of scandal or social disruption. That choice belongs entirely to him, and the consequences of that choice are his to bear, not yours. What you are responsible for is what you do with the knowledge of what occurred, and the opportunity that your sister's death has provided you to ensure that her sacrifice was not made in vain." The trial of Crispin Marchmont began on a grey November morning at the York Assizes, and it proceeded with the sort of measured deliberation that characterizes English legal proceedings when the evidence is sufficiently conclusive to render the outcome largely predetermined. The prosecution presented its case with meticulous care, laying out the timeline of events with the precision of a master craftsman assembling a particularly complex mechanism. Rose Twiggs testified regarding Marchmont's insistence upon witnessing the addition of the tincture to the milk, her recollection made more credible by the evident discomfort she experienced at having been unwittingly drawn into her employer's crime. The locksmith provided detailed technical testimony regarding the particular nature of the new lock's mechanism and Marchmont's extensive inquiries into its operation. The medical examiner presented his analysis of the laudanum concentration in the milk bottle, demonstrating with mathematical clarity that the quantity present was entirely inconsistent with a therapeutic dose and aligned precisely with what would be required to produce death in an individual of Mrs. Henrietta Marchmont's physical constitution. The mended hem of Henrietta's dress was introduced as evidence suggesting that she had been preparing for something, perhaps a journey to Brussels to retrieve her sister, perhaps the composition of a new will that would have provided for Margaret's assistance, some action that would have been entirely consistent with the letter discovered upon her desk and entirely inconsistent with Crispin Marchmont's preferred outcome. The defense counsel attempted with considerable vigor to construct an alternative narrative, arguing that the evidence regarding the lock's installation and Marchmont's inquiries into its mechanism could be interpreted as simple domestic concern rather than evidence of premeditation. They presented witnesses who testified to Marchmont's character and his reputation for orderliness and attention to domestic detail. They argued that the quantity of laudanum might have been miscalculated, that Marchmont's intent might have been merely to seder his wife rather than to cause her death, and that the fatal outcome might legitimately be characterized as tragic accident rather than deliberate murder. But the jury, composed of Yorkshire businessmen and farmers accustomed to distinguishing between honest error and deliberate deception, appeared largely unmoved by these arguments. They deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder most foul. Peter attended the trial proceedings with the detached interest of a man observing a theatrical production that confirmed what he had already anticipated, and he departed York before the sentencing hearing, having determined that his continued presence would serve no useful purpose. Instead, he devoted his attention to the far more pressing matter of ensuring that Margaret's circumstances were addressed with the sort of compassionate practicality that her situation demanded and that her sister had been attempting to provide at the moment of her death. He consulted with his own solicitors regarding the establishment of a trust fund that would provide for Margaret's financial security and that of her child, arranging matters with such discretion that the source of the funds was never rendered public. Through carefully cultivated connections within the social welfare community, he identified a suitable family, childless, of respectable if modest means, possessed of genuine affection for children and the capacity to provide a stable home environment, who agreed to provide care for Margaret's infant daughter with the understanding that Margaret, herself, would be permitted regular contact and involvement in the child's upbringing. When Peter finally visited Margaret at the modest cottage in Surrey that had been arranged for her, he found her engaged in the sort of domestic activity that suggested her circumstances had undergone a profound transformation. She was mending a child's dress, the work performed with the careful attention of someone who had learned to find meaning in small acts of care and restoration, and she looked up from her work as Peter entered the sitting room with an expression combining gratitude and a sort of determined resilience that suggested she had begun the difficult process of reconstructing her life from the debris of tragedy. "I have been thinking about my sister," she said without preamble, gesturing for Peter to take a seat. "I have been thinking about what she attempted to do and what she was willing to sacrifice to assist me. The solicitors tell me that Henrietta made a new will only 3 days before her death and that she left a substantial portion of her personal property to me. They tell me that she had consulted with them regarding my situation and that she had provided detailed instructions for how the funds were to be used to support me and my daughter. She was preparing everything before Crispin murdered her. Peter nodded slowly, understanding in this revelation the precise moment when Henrietta had determined upon her course of action, and when Crispin Marchmont had begun to comprehend the full scope of the disaster that threatened his carefully constructed world. "Your sister was a woman of remarkable moral clarity," he said quietly. "She understood that assistance rendered out of love is never truly an inconvenience, regardless of the social disruption it might occasion. She was prepared to face scandal, to confront her family, to reconstruct her entire life if necessary, in order to ensure that you were not abandoned to your circumstances. Your brother-in-law could not comprehend this. To him, your situation represented nothing more than an obstacle to be eliminated, and when he discovered that your sister was determined to remove that obstacle through honesty and compassion rather than through silence and denial, he determined upon the only solution his limited moral imagination could conceive. "The magistrate," Margaret said hesitantly. "They tell me that Crispin has been sentenced to death, that he will be hanged. Such is the penalty for murder in this country," Peter confirmed, and his tone carried no particular emotion on the subject. "Justice, Miss Margaret, is rarely a comforting thing. It does not restore the dead to life, nor does it undo the suffering that has been occasioned. It merely ensures that those who commit grievous wrongs are held accountable for their actions and that society is protected from the repetition of such crimes. Your sister's murder will not be avenged by Crispin's death, but it will be acknowledged, and that acknowledgement may provide some small measure of comfort to those who loved her and who are attempting to comprehend why such a tragedy occurred." Peter rose to take his leave, and Margaret accompanied him to the door with a sort of grace that suggested she had begun to understand that life, however fundamentally altered by tragedy, must nonetheless proceed with the acceptance and dignity that characterizes those who refuse to permit circumstance to determine their character. "I want to thank you," she said quietly, "for what you have done, for discovering what occurred, for ensuring that justice was served, for assisting me in my current circumstances. My sister would have approved of you, I think. She valued intelligence and integrity above all other qualities." Peter smiled, a genuine expression that contained both warmth and a certain weariness born of long acquaintance with human weakness and frailty. "Your sister," he said, adjusting his coat with meticulous care, "was precisely the sort of woman for whom intelligence without integrity would have been entirely insufferable. She understood that the only thing that distinguishes us from the beasts is our willingness to honor our obligations to one another, regardless of the social cost. Crispin Marchmont failed to understand this, and that failure cost him everything. I trust that you will not make a similar mistake, and that you will permit your sister's sacrifice to serve as inspiration rather than burden as you undertake the considerable work of rebuilding your life." He paused at the threshold, turning back with that particular quality of expression that characterized his final observations on cases that had touched him more deeply than his manner typically suggested. "One final thought, Miss Margaret. That mended hem upon your sister's dress was the detail that confirmed for me the precise nature of the crime. It represented her preparation, her determination to act, her refusal to permit circumstance to dictate her choices. I trust you will honor that legacy by doing precisely the same.